Welcome to Ray's Reflection, the Common Man's Bible Study. We are still on our trip to Rome with the Apostle Paul. His trial in Caesarea is over, and he has been commended to Caesar. And Agrippa says this, Then said Agrippa unto Festus, This man might have been set at liberty if he had not appealed unto Caesar. Now, as far as I'm concerned, they could have released him. All they had to do was ask Paul to remove his request. But by releasing him there in Caesarea, the Jews would have captured him and killed him. So instead, it seems that they're doing this to protect him. Now, the very next thing it says here in chapter 27, verse 1, and when it was determined that we should set sail onto Italy, they delivered Paul and other prisoners, and certain other prisoners, unto one named Julius, a centurion of the Augustus band. Now the Augustus band is obviously the Caesar's band of men, which would be equivalent to our SEALs team. This man was very capable in what he was doing, very trained in warfare. Let's stop for a moment and see where we are. Paul has been tried, and he's really found not guilty. I mean, they didn't find anything they could accuse him of. The other thing we have to assume is Julius here was in on that trial, and he heard the trial, and he heard what was going on, or he was told by Agrippa and Festus that Paul was not an ordinary prisoner. He really wasn't guilty at all, but he had appealed to Caesar. So they were going to Rome. Now, when you look at the scenario, and we see Paul getting on a ship, and he's getting on a ship as a prisoner, and he is with other prisoners. So it seems to me that the imputation of the reputation of the prisoners wrapped around Paul, and therefore he was another prisoner. If we look at the book of Acts, and we see that this is the start of the early church, we see that miracles, speaking in tongues, things like this, became evidence to substantiate the message the person was delivering. So that if a person could perform a miracle, then, they recognized that the miracle could only be from God, then this man was also from God, then they would listen to what he had to say. His message must also be from God. And this was important. Right at this moment, Paul is getting on a ship as a prisoner. Can his message be believed? And the answer is no. Who would listen to a prisoner? And the answer is no one. So therefore, God, and you remember we're talking about the providence of God, God working behind the scenes to set things. What you're going to look at, what you're going to see in the next two chapters is basically God working so that his message is delivered to whoever he wants it delivered to. So right now he has to vilify the Apostle Paul as a messenger from God, because right now he is a prisoner. He is a lowlife. He is a nobody. So therefore, if he is a nobody, then his message is nothing, and no one's going to listen to it. Now there is well over 100 people on this ship. They will tell us later in the passage just how many they are, but you have to remember they stop, they pick up, they drop off, and so on, so they change. But at one point, they will tell us how many people were on that ship. So, therefore, God has to work the circumstances around and give Paul opportunity to make statements, to do things, whatever it takes, so that when he's at the end of his journey, or whenever he reaches a point where God wants him to speak about the gospel, he will be able to speak. And people will listen to him because they realize that he is a man from God. Now, so all the circumstances are designed to make the people understand that he is a man from God. And some of the circumstances that God decides to put him through is absolutely amazing. The only one on this entire ship that has confidence in getting to Rome safely is Paul. And I'm not sure I can use the word safely. Let's say get to Rome. And what what he goes through is not things that aren't very safe, but the whole point is to get him to substantiate the gospel. You have to substantiate the man, and this is what God is doing. So keep that in mind as we go through this and look at the events. They're just not events. They're events set up by God to substantiate the man, so that the man can deliver a message, therefore substantiating the message. Okay, so let's begin. Okay, we're with Paul, and they're going to take off, and they're going to go to Rome. Now, let us take a look at this, and we will see that I will show you another map like this. Now, they're leaving from Caesarea. They're going to go up to Sidon. They're going to move up around. You will see this arrow. They come all the way over here to Antipatris, and then they move across here to Cnidus over here. And then they come down here under Crete, sail across, and this is where they get into this tornado, this hurricane rather, in here, etc. They come up here to this little island of Malta, and then they go up to Sicily, and then they eventually up to Rome. This is his path that he's going to take. Now, you would think that they would have crossed here, gone across this way. But you have to remember, they are sailing from the middle of September to the middle of November in the United States. We call this the hurricane season. It actually begins in August. And the hurricanes will move from they'll move from east to west. They move in west, especially in the northern hemisphere. They move in a westerly direction, so that when you look at the Mediterranean here, etc., the hurricane would move this way, in this direction. They'd move this way, and you will see that they catch on. So anyway, they're in a ship, and entering into a ship of Adamatia, we put to sea, meaning to sail by the coast of Asia. One Aristarchus, a Macedonian in Thessalonica, being with us. Now you remember his name will appear in other epistles. And the next day we touch in Sidon. Now you will notice where Sidon is. If I turn around here, you go Caesarea and up to Sidon here. He says this. He says we touched on Sidon, and Julius courteously treated Paul and gave him liberty to go on to his friends to refresh himself. So when he was in Sidon, Julius let him go and let him meet his friends, etc., realizing that he would come back. Now, Julius didn't go with him. Now, it's interesting that this centurion who has been put in to guard the prison, and realizing the rule of Rome, that if you lose a prisoner, you forfeit your life, had no problem with Paul. So it seems that he was told about Paul, and that Paul was really an innocent man, and therefore he wasn't too afraid of losing him. So it seems that Julius here knows that Paul is something different than the other prisoners. So already God is working in the circumstances to put a man who is very confident in Paul to guard Paul, or the head of the prisoners. It says this, and when we had put to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus. Now, obviously, the lee is where the winds would blow this way, from west to east, and the lee would be up on this side. So they're on the lee side of Cyprus here. Instead of going from Sidon all the way this way, which would have been a shorter distance, they went up here, because between the month of September to the middle of November, you had the Mediterranean was a terrible place to sail, but you could still sail. From November to the early spring, nobody sailed across the Mediterranean. There just was no shipping at all. The height of the shipping was during the summer, and then it eased off when it reached into September because of these hurricane-type storms that would arise. He says, and then he says this, he said, and when we had sailed over the sea to Cilicia. Now Cilicia is this province right here. So they're sailing underneath Asia Minor, right here. This is Cilicia right here. And he says this, and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycius. Now Myra would be right here. This is where they came. They sailed along this, and notice how they hugged the shoreline. And this is what the ships would usually do. They'd sail for the day. They'd sail, 60, 70, 80 miles, and they'd pull over into a port. And then the next morning they'd take off again, sail another 60, 70 miles, and so on. It says this, and when we, and there the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing into Italy, and he put us on board. In other words, now they changed ships, and they picked a ship up here in Myra that was going to Italy, and therefore that's the one they got on. So it was a much bigger ship. It wasn't a coast hugger. The one they were on was a coast hugger. And it says this, and when we had sailed slowly many days, and scarcely were come off of Cnidus, in other words, they sailed many days to get to this point here. All right. The wind not permitting us, you've got a westerly wind, and obviously it's quite strong, etc., it's pushing against them, so they had to tack, go back and forth. And the wind not permitting us, we sailed under the lee of Crete off of Salome. And we passed it with difficulty. We came onto a place which is called Fair Haven. Now they came down here, sailed down here, and this is Fair Haven. Here, this will be the last time that they will have good weather. And near to which was the city of Lycia. Now Lycia would be same place, it's about right here. And now he says this. Now, when such time was spent, and when sailing was now dangerous, now we're in between September and November, because the fast was now already past, Paul admonished them. Now, before we get into what Paul said to them, is this: the fast he's talking about here is the Passover, and so that period of time, the Day of Atonement, is now over, etc. And the ship which left Caesarea, which is made up mostly of Jews, etc., they're done with this. And he says this. He said unto them, Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with injury and much damage, not only to the cargo and ship, but also of our lives. And he tells them ahead of time. Okay, he says, I perceive. Now, how did he perceive this? We don't know. Did God tell him? Did an angel appear unto him, etc.? And he will tell us how he knows. And he tells them that we are headed into a very dangerous situation. And the danger is going to be not only to the crew, it's going to be to the ship, it's going to be to the cargo. And he's hinting that maybe you're going to lose everything. And so he tells them ahead of time, like just as if he were a prophet, which he is. He says, nevertheless, the centurion believed the master and the owner of the ship. In other words, obviously what he's telling you here is he's telling you that there was a contradictory statement. The master and the owner of the ship obviously had one idea in mind and believed it was safe to travel, to sail. And Paul comes along with something that contradicts that. And he says, oh no, we're going to be in big trouble, and we're going to be in danger of our lives. The ship's going to be in danger we're going to be in danger of losing the ship, losing the cargo. And he tells them ahead of time. And he tells them while they're in Fair Haven, which is pretty much staying, they were away from the wind, they were protected, and therefore he's telling them at a time when it's calm and peaceful, and he's telling them something that they can't visually see. He says this, okay, and more than those things which were spoken of by Paul, in other words, everybody sided with the owner, the ship sided with the owner of the ship and said, nah, we're going to take our chances. And because the haven was not commodious to winter in other words, Fair Haven was not a good place to winter in. In other words, the port was open, and it would batter the ships, and the weather that they would experience was terrible. So therefore, it was not a good place to winter. And it says this, and the greater part advised to depart from there also, if by any means they might attain to Phoenicia, and there to winter, which is an haven of Crete. Now, Phoenicia is just up the coast. In other words, they're here, they're going to go to Phoenix here, which is just up the coast, and that would be a much better place to winter if they had to winter. And it says, lies towards the southwest and the northwest. And when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, loosing from there, they sailed close by Crete. In other words, when they left Fair Haven, etc., they had gentle winds. And therefore they assumed that the captain of the ship knew what he was talking about. And Paul did not. So immediately God sets up a contrast, huge contrast. You can listen to the voice of this shipmaster, or you can listen to the voice of God through Paul. But they didn't realize it was the voice of God yet. But this is what we get in our lives many times, etc. We get the two contrasts, and people tend to fade to the non-God side, so to speak, because they can't see. They can only use their senses. They can't look at things through faith. They can only use their physical senses to determine what is right and what is wrong, and therefore this is what they will choose. And it says this, and I put this here, it says this, but not long after there arose again in it a tempestuous wind called Euroclydon, or you can say Euroclydon. Either way, I think the pronunciation would be correct either way. Everybody would understand what you're talking about. And what he's talking about is he's talking about a hurricane. He's talking about winds well over 100 miles an hour. Winds that would be too hard for a ship this size to buck against. And therefore, they took off and they got caught in this hurricane. Now, remember what I told you, this hurricanes in the northern hemisphere, and this is the northern hemisphere, go from east to west, work this way. And eventually they make a turn and they will go up, and just like they do in the United States. And they do the same thing in the Pacific, only they're not called hurricanes in the Pacific, they're called typhoons. But that works the same way. It goes from east to west, and when it gets close to shore, it makes a curve northward. This is going to do the same thing. And now they're here, in Fair Haven, they left here, etc. They came over here to Phoenix, and then they headed out. And when they headed out, they got caught into this storm here. So instantly, you begin to see that the captain was wrong. Paul was right. Now you're in danger. So that's the first hint. It says, and when the ship was caught and could not bear up into the wind, we let her drive. In other words, they couldn't steer it. The wind was so strong, etc., that they couldn't steer the ship. So therefore, they just let the hurricane take them. So they get into this, and the hurricane just grabs a hold of that ship and just drives it. And if we go back, it will drive it. That hurricane the ship will stay within that hurricane all the way to here, to Malta. And so this is where they are. It says this. He says, so we just let her drive. And running under the lee of a certain island, which is called Coda, that would be, Coda would be somewhere right in here. Right here, probably. If I go back to the, no. Let me go back, if I could, to the other, this would be Coda right here. See that? So the hurricane picked them up right off the coast of Crete, and now it wouldn't let them go back to Crete, so they got right underneath Coda, right here. They sailed right underneath this little island, Coda. That's what he said. To a certain island called Coda. We had much work to secure the boat, so they had to literally secure the boat. Now, how did they secure the boat? Which, when we had hoisted it, now they have a dinghy, a small boat, etc., that they tow. A large ship like that would have a small boat they tow, so that if you had to abandon the ship, you had something to get into. And what they would do is they would haul it behind them. They would tow it behind them. And now, because of these winds, fierce wind, they were very afraid that the boat that small dinghy, etc., would get full of water, etc., and sink, and they'd lose that. So what they did is they pulled it up, put it on shore, and rather put it on inside the boat. It says this: they used help undergirding the ship, and fearing lest they should fall into the quicksand, strike sail, and so were driven. So what they would do when they would fasten that ship, secure that ship, is they would take large ropes, a large rope, they would call those ropes cables, and they would wrap it around the ship to keep the hull from collapsing, because you've got to remember those hulls were not put on by nails, etc. They had another way of engineering it, but they weren't bolted on, so you couldn't rip them off. In a strong storm like this, the ship would literally come apart, and therefore to keep the hull intact, they wrapped cables around. And I don't know how many cables they wrapped around it, but here they did that. They wrapped and tightened those cables, etc., so the hull of the ship wouldn't come apart. And so that's what they did. And he says because they might hit a shoal, they might hit a reef, they might hit something, then the boat would be torn completely apart. So to keep that from happening, this is what they did with the cables. He says, and we being exceedingly tossed with the tempest, the next day we lighten the ship. In other words, they started to lighten the ship to make it a little more easy to maneuver. He says, on the third day we cast out with our own hands the tackle of the ship. In other words, notice the we. In other words, everybody who got involved, etc., and started lightening the ship on the third day. And when neither sun nor star in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay upon us, all hope that we should be saved was then taken away. In other words, they had no idea where they were. In the hurricane, the clouds, etc., were dark, etc., so they could tell when it was day, because the sun would shine and you'd have more light, then they could see when it was night, but they couldn't navigate. They didn't know where they were. They couldn't see the stars, they couldn't see the sun. All their means of navigation were gone. So where they were, they had no idea where they were. They were just in the middle of a storm. And it had been, it said here, many days, but you would see it was a good 14 days and a good 2 weeks that they were in this storm, as the storm was moving. It says this, and after being long without food, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, sirs, we should have hearkened unto me. In other words, now he's bringing it back. Now, you should have listened to me. And it's not a I told you so. It's a statement of don't forget I'm the one who told you that we would be in danger. And what I am saying is true. And later on it will be very important. So he's got to start putting confidence. Then he says this, sirs, you should have hearkened unto me and not have loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss. And now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but only of the ship. In other words, he tells them, okay, I told you that this was going to happen. And this was the bad news. Now with the good news. The good news, nobody's life will be lost. The ship will be lost, but nobody's life will be lost. So now he's getting on their good side. Okay, when he opens his mouth and says, you should have listened to me, it's almost as if he's going to come up with some more bad news. And instead he comes up with some good news. At least good news for the passengers, as opposed to the ship master. He's going to lose all his cargo and he's going to lose his ship. Now it says this, he says, now I'm going to tell you why now. Now he introduces the concept of God. Now he loses the concept of God. He introduces it. He says there, for there stood by me this night an angel of God, whom I am and whom I serve. Now he brings in God. He says, in other words, if I last night was in connection with God, etc., then when I told you that this was going to happen, then I must have also been in connection with God. They're going to start putting this together. Now, it says this, saying, fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar, and lo, God has given thee all them that sail with thee. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheers, for I believe God that it shall be even as it hath told me. However, we must be cast upon a certain island. Now he tells them ahead of time what's going to happen. Now I'm going to stop there. And we're going to look at the situation now. He told him, this is what happened last night. This is the angel of the Lord appeared unto me, etc. And he told me this. And this is who he represents. He represents God. So God has told me this is going to happen. We're going to lose a ship, but we're not going to lose one man on the ship. And now to show you that what I'm telling you is correct, etc., and that God did speak to me, we're going to hit a certain island. We're going to hit a small island. They haven't hit it yet. So the fact that he's telling them that they're going to hit this island, etc., is going to substantiate his message. Now, if you look at what has happened, and we'll stop there, and we'll pick it up next week, but if you look at what has happened, etc., you will see that God is slowly putting in the minds of the passengers that this man he's not just a prisoner. He is a very special prisoner. He is a prisoner of God, and he has given them information about things that they cannot see or they cannot believe. So right now they're going to hold in reserve the fact that of what he is saying, and when they hit that island, things are going to start falling into place. So we'll wait till next week to find out how this all works out, but God is getting the people on the boat ready to hear the message from Paul. So until next week, I bid you Godspeed from On Victory's Side. We'll see you next week.